right, good afternoon. We're going to be doing notes today with me on video because unfortunately I have to be home with a sick baby. So I have behind me a notebook. If you guys could just follow along with me as I go through the information. This is going to be our second part of cellular respiration. We're going to be focused on this one, on the aerobic cellular respiration. Aerobic has to do with that oxygen. So let's go over here and get started. Here's my right page, and here's my left page. Top of the right page, we've got to get our title on here. So our title for this one is Cellular Respiration, Part 2. So make sure we get, there we go, get our title there, Cellular Respiration, Part 2. Underneath that, we have Aerobic Cellular Respiration. And once we have aerobic cellular respiration down, we can draw our line separating our page into this left side and this right side. So over here on the left is our aerobic cellular respiration. Something like that down. And just a little bit of information about this aerobic cellular respiration. Number one, most of this process occurs in the mighty mitochondria. So we'll jot that mitochondria down. And I'm going to put in parentheses mostly. There you go, occurs in the mitochondria mostly. And uses oxygen, O2. Extremely important to remember that this is using oxygen. So it occurs in the mitochondria and uses oxygen. This particular process is made up of 3 steps. Step number 1, on the left side of our line. Step number 1 is called glycolysis. Glycolysis, which is exactly the same as step number 1 in anaerobic respiration. In glycolysis, this is where the sugar, that is C6H12O6, is broken into 2 pyruvate molecules, also known as pyruvic acid. This particular process of glycolysis produces 2 molecules of ATP. If oxygen, O2, is present, if it is there, then, and we'll put a couple dots after that, then something else happens. Last class period we talked about if the oxygen is present, then it goes into fermentation. Here, if the oxygen is present, then we have some other things that happen, and that is our step number 2. Step number 2. Over here on the left. Move this up so you can see it a little bit better. Step number 2 is called the, better underline glycolysis, Krebs cycle, also known as citric acid cycle. Underline those guys there as well. So what happens with the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle is if there is oxygen present, then that pyruvic acid is going to move into the mitochondria. So pyruvic acid, or pyruvate, same thing, moves into the mighty mitochondria. It is completely in, down, into the C's, into the H's, and into the O's. This particular process produces carbon dioxide, those C's and O's hooked together as a waste product. So out comes that carbon dioxide. We don't want to keep anything that's a waste around. It also, because those bonds have broken from those C's, those H's, and those O's, we have some energy available. Produces ATP. Actually, it produces 2 ATP. Make sure we get that in there. And what we have left over, we have hydrogen, the H, and some electrons floating around. Left over. So let's go over to our left page and let's attempt here to draw a picture of what's actually happening in this particular process so far. So on our left page, we have our cell, so we'll draw that cell membrane all the way around the outside like I've done before. We'll adjust our view here just a little bit. There we are. So here is the cell membrane so that we all know. We have our glucose, C6H12O6 in our cell. This glucose is split in the process of glycolysis, and it produces 2 pyruvic acid molecules and, very importantly, 2 ATP. That's exactly what we talked about in our last class. If there is no oxygen, then we have fermentation. But today, we're talking about what happens if there is oxygen, if oxygen is present. And if oxygen is present, then we have to go into this big, huge, kind of jelly bean, kidney bean sort of shaped organelle, which is called our mitochondria. Mighty mitochondria. Now, just like the chloroplast, the mitochondria also has an outer membrane. That's what we just drew right here. Outer membrane. And if it has an outer membrane, that should tell you that it also has an inner membrane. But the inner membrane is a little bit different here. It's actually bigger than the outer membrane. So we have this inner membrane that folds all inside the matrix. And the matrix is the name of the space that is on the inside of the mighty mitochondria. So here is our inner membrane. Inner membrane. And this space inside here, like I just mentioned, is called the matrix. Then we have all these finger-like projections, these folds sticking into that matrix. These folds, we'll label them right down here. These are called the cristae. So now we have this pyruvic acid, if there is oxygen present, going into our mitochondria. When it goes into the mitochondria, we'll draw that picture going right over here. This is where the citric acid cycle happens. Once this citric acid cycle is happening, that pyruvic acid is all broken apart, and out comes carbon dioxide. We'll put a little arrow on the end of that carbon dioxide. And, of course, most importantly, out comes 2 ATP. So we'll put a little arrow right here as well. But we are not done. Let's move back over here to our right page. I didn't write down here exactly where this is happening, so let's make sure we write down here that this occurs in the matrix. That's the space of that mitochondria. And our step 3 of 3, so this is our last step. Our last step is called electron transport. Electron transport. And with electron transport, it's going to use those hydrogen and those electrons to produce ATP. So, uses, move this up so you can see it a little bit better, hydrogen and electrons to produce ATP. How does it do that? Well, the hydrogen must move through the inner membrane. Hydrogen must move through the inner membrane. To do that, it moves through a protein, which is actually an enzyme. Proteins are enzymes. Not all proteins are enzymes. Proteins can be enzymes. So it moves through a protein, an enzyme called ATP synthase. ATP synthase. And this particular enzyme is going to make ATP. Makes, wait for it, makes a lot of ATP. It actually makes 34 ATP from that one glucose molecule that we started off with in glycolysis. That's a tremendous amount of ATP energy. Now, once the hydrogen do that, the hydrogen are going to meet up with our friend the oxygen. So hydrogen bonds with oxygen to make water. H2O. Hydrogen bonds with oxygen to make water. So let's go back over to our picture. We have the pyruvic acid going into the citric acid cycle, breaking apart. The C's and the O's hook together and come out as carbon dioxide. 2 ATP is created. And then the hydrogen is going to move through the inner membrane. That oxygen moves in, and when the hydrogen and the oxygen get together in here, out comes H2O, and most importantly, 34 ATP. So we have 34, we have 2, and up here again we have 2 more, so there's a total of 38 molecules of ATP that are made from that one sugar. That is a huge amount of energy from each individual molecule of sugar that can be made in this particular process of aerobic cellular respiration. Now, for some of you, you might look at this and think, wow, this is really complicated. But look back at our steps. Step 1 we already talked about. It's exactly the same. So really it's just these 2 things. The pyruvic acid is completely broken down here in the Krebs cycle, produces carbon dioxide and a little bit of ATP. The leftover hydrogen has to move through that inner membrane where it matches up with water or with oxygen to make water. And by moving through that inner membrane, it causes this enzyme to make ATP. And that's really all that you need to know. Hopefully you'll be able to get this down and then work on the worksheet that will be passed out to you here in just a moment. Again, we will be able to answer questions on this next class period, and we will be able to do a lab on this next class period as well. Hopefully you'll have some success moving through the worksheet. On the worksheet, don't worry about the terms FADH2 and NADH. All they are molecules that carry the hydrogen. You don't need to know about those. They're just hydrogen-carrying molecules. That's all. All right? Good luck on the worksheet, and we'll be answering questions for you on Thursday.